So I'm back with another video, and this video is going to be 5 books which changed my perspective on life. I've been meaning to make this video for a while, but I've been getting my notes ready and getting everything sorted, and I'm back. I'm really loving the book content recently, so I thought I'd do another one. And I've got 5 books to show you today. So these are the books I'm going to be talking about. There's so many books that I wish I could have included, but I wanted to keep it concise because I just wanted to highlight my favourite books which changed my perspective. Not just life, but just in general. When I mean change my perspective on life, not like a drastic change, but more it just gave me more insight into life. And I don't know, I felt like not changed after reading it, but it just opened my eyes more after reading these books. So these are the top 5 which I'm going to be talking about. My list was initially around 8 books, and I was like, no, let me keep it concise, and I cut it down to 5 books, and which was a hard choice. But yeah, so I've got Lord of the Flies, 1984, The Trial, Frankenstein, and Tuesdays with Morrie. Some of them I read a while ago, some of them I've read recently. But yeah, I'm just gonna go straight into it because I always waffle in my intros and I just need to keep it to the point. I'm just gonna start off with, I don't know, I had like I kind of had some notes on all of the books I'm gonna be talking about. And I guess it's not really in any particular order, but I guess it just goes from my favourites. So I'm going to start off with 1984 by George Orwell, and this book is one of my favourite books that I've ever read in my life. I've read this around 3 times just because it's that great, and I feel like each time I've read it there's always like some new insight or discovery that I seem to make on it. But yeah, this is by George Orwell. It's quite a short novel, to be fair. It's only like 300 pages, yeah, around like 300 pages, which is pretty short. And this book, I remember the first time I read it, like after reading it, I actually thought like my whole life had changed. He wrote this in the 1940s, and it basically just predicts like what he thought life was going to be like, and it was so far worse, I guess you could say, than what he predicted. Like how they say life is so much more extreme than what he thought, and it's so interesting to see how he thought it was going to be like with the telescreen surveillance. Like, it's so fascinating to see that. The book is a dystopian novel about a sort of dystopian totalitarian society and the sort of prevailing influence it has on surveillance, monitoring people's behaviour, thoughts, and just day-to-day life. It looks into sort of the idea of an autonomy, freedom, and like freedom of speech particularly, and how as like time goes on people are sort of conditioned to have the same thoughts and support the same ideas, when sort of individual freedom is kind of like restricted and, you know, censored basically. So in this book it's basically about how the ruling party, Big Brother, and the sort of government is in charge, and they want everything to be in line with how they see things. And it just kind of follows the main character, Winston Smith, who kind of has an initial thought and is like, oh, I'm going to go against that, and it follows his journey of, I guess, self-discovery, or I guess you could say rediscovery, against the party, which they do not want. They want everyone to conform to the same beliefs. They don't want anyone to think negatively about the party or anything. So they're basically just conditioning people to love Big Brother, love the party, and it's like inscribed into them like day to day. Like they have to repeat the chants, like repeat their like status, like I love Big Brother. Like there's this whole insult thing, there's double think, thought crime, like you can't even think of anything bad about the party. Like that's how extreme it is. Winston Smith, he works in the Ministry of Truth, which I guess is a governmental organisation, and it just basically follows his story of how he comes to think against the party and the consequences of that. It follows his journey, dealing with his own past, questioning his current reality, and he kind of had these glimpses of what life used to be like before the party, and it kind of parallels that to what he is doing presently. And he basically works in a department where the truth is manipulated. So even that in itself is such an important factor of the book. Like he works in a part of the government or the party that is literally manipulating the truth. Like they don't want the population to know what is going on. And yeah, I just think this book is a very spot on, interesting take on, I guess, how we can be manipulated to support certain ideas, and how we follow mainstream media, and how we're not, I guess, taught to have original thought, which obviously people do. That's how the world is, but it just looks into like a larger structure of society. And themes of freedom, personal autonomy, surveillance, and basically just how that functions in society. And it kind of looks at ideas of, you know, who are we if we have our freedom taken away? Do we have, you know, our morals intact, and the importance of being able to speak freely and have our own ideas. So it's a nice, interesting take that the book has. I would definitely read it again, and I don't know, just pick certain parts of the book to kind of look deeper into, because I've read it so many times, and certain bits of it I think I've overlooked and I think have more importance than it actually does. So yeah, definitely need to read over that. Next book, I'm going to go on to Lord of the Flies, which is another book that I read when I was quite young actually. I think I read this when I was like 15 or so, and it was kind of like the first classic that I read. Yeah, this is a Lord of the Flies, William Golding, another British classic. And I remember reading this in school for like a GCSE. It wasn't even like a required reading, but I remember reading it for like this project that we had to do. And I remember I was so like interested, I got so hooked on it, because we had to write a speech on something, and I chose how laws and order are like important for society, and like why we need social structures, which was actually like low-key ahead of my time, like not me looking into that when I was like 15. It was a cool concept for me at the time, and I just sort of got into that side of reading. But this book is kind of on the same lines as a 1984 in terms of like dystopian novel type book, but this book follows a plane crash of this group of schoolboys, and it basically looks into how they kind of cope with that. They try to set their own hierarchy, their social structures, their order, and yeah, it just looks into the importance of having, I guess, a social structure and the consequences of not having one. Like if we're left to our own devices, kind of chaos just emerges and people take up power. Some people become like weaker in a hierarchy, and it's just an interesting take on looking at human nature. And this, oh my god, my camera's gonna die. Okay, so my camera died, but I'm back. I can't really remember where I was and what I was saying. I think I was talking about Lord of the Flies, but Lord of the Flies, 10 out of 10 book. It looks at ideas of natural instincts and human nature, and whether we are violent creatures like to the core, and without like social structures and order, like what are we and what morals do we have left with. And basically, as it explores the kind of like natural ability humans have to create order and create a hierarchy, and even in like the middle of nowhere, deserted on an island, these group of boys seem to create their own sort of system of power, and they have the conch of, you know, if you're holding the conch you can talk, and it's kind of, they create their own power system, and they base it on what they see day to day. And yeah, I just thought it was a really interesting take on human nature, which when you study philosophy like a bit higher level, it's so interesting to see like stories and sort of like, not stories I guess, yeah, stories, books, novels, which kind of look at human nature without directly talking about it. And because it's kind of focused on the group of boys, it's a different take on it rather than looking at human nature in adults. It kind of goes back to childhood and the kind of natural state of humans. And yeah, I thought it was a really interesting book. Yeah, I need to reread this actually because it's just amazing, and I haven't read it in a while. I've only read this once, but it's similar vibes to 1984 and also kind of Brave New World, that kind of side of books, which I really love. I just think they're so interesting. But yeah, I like the kind of side of things where it looks at like material possessions and what are we without material possessions, and it kind of leaves us with our natural instincts and our natural kind of order to, you know, hunt, gather, like that's primitive nature of humans. It looks at how humans are naturally violent as well, which some social theorists like look at how humans are naturally violent, but they're kind of conditioned to not be in society so they can like have order. And then there's other theories which suggest otherwise, that we're not violent, we're loving creatures, and society makes people act out. So it's kind of just a nice, it's an interesting take on that, and nature versus nurture. I actually mentioned this book in my personal statement when I was applying for law, which, long story short, I didn't end up doing a law degree, but I mentioned it as the kind of first book I read that introduced me to looking at order and laws in society, and why that's kind of useful, why it is useful to create order, why we need social structures. I'm so happy that I did read this book. I kind of read it I think I got it for Christmas, and I was like, yeah, I'm just gonna read it and then write my speech on it when I did my GCSEs. But I'm so glad I did, because it's so, I don't know, it's so interesting. I love it. I need to reread this. Interesting. I keep saying the word interesting, and I hate that. I need to find more words, but I don't. So the next book I'm going to be talking about is Tuesdays with Morrie by Mitch Albom, and this book honestly made me cry. Like, this is how good this book is, and I think everyone needs to read it. It's just one of those books that like everyone needs to read in their life. Like, it's such a beautifully written book, and I didn't think like I'd like it as much as I did. I just didn't think I'd expect to like it this much, and it was just amazing. I first read a bit of it in my first year of uni when I was doing this module, and anyways, we had to look at a bit of this book on how education is important and how communication is like such an important factor for people to like learn, not just like small interactions, but on a bigger scale, like why education is important. So that's kind of like the first time I'd heard of this book, and then I decided to read it properly the other week. So it took me a couple weeks to read. It's only a small book, but such a beautiful book. It's basically about this teacher who gets diagnosed with ALS, which I've written down what ALS actually is because it's so hard to pronounce. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. So the teacher gets diagnosed with that, and it's basically about him living out his final days, and he reunites with a student of his who is the person who wrote this book, and basically just goes over their last kind of lessons of life, and they talk about death, success, happiness, purpose in life, and it's just them two meeting up every Tuesday before he dies. And it's just looks at having a purpose in life even if you're coming to the end of your life. It faces like the fact of how death is something that is inevitable in life, and you have to face it. And it's kind of a nice parallel between Mitch, who's learning from him, and also the teacher Morrie, who's coming to terms with his death, and he's kind of passing on that knowledge before he goes, which that in itself is what created this book. And it's everyone who reads this book is picking up on that, and it's such a beautifully written book. It just, and especially from Mitch's side as well, it looks into how he followed this kind of life purpose of finding success, and it isn't what he thought it was, and looks into what actually is important in life and finding that purpose. And I'm just so glad I read this, and so glad I was like introduced to this book, because it's just such an amazing book. Like, genuinely, after reading this, it just makes you think differently, which is kind of what I wanted to include in this video, just books that made me think differently about life. And it's one of those books that will kind of make you feel a bit inspired after, and inspired to take action and think, okay, this is what I want to pursue. So I had to include this book in this video. Yeah, it just is such a beautifully written book, and it kind of goes into this philosophical concepts of life and death and the meaning of life. So the teacher is a sociology teacher, so obviously it includes ideas on that, but just the book in itself and how the structure is between the student and the teacher is such a nice like interaction between the two, and the parallels of their lives. You know, someone growing up and kind of getting born into their life, not born into their life, they're an adult, but in how they are kind of going into their life with a new idea, to someone who's leaving their life behind and kind of reminiscing on everything that they've learned. So yeah, it's such a beautiful book, and it just, I guess the main themes of it is looking at human connection and the importance of that, and communicating with one another. It's such a beautifully written book. And yeah, just finding meaning in life, and it doesn't have to be this big grand thing. It can be something small, but as long as it makes you happy, then that is what is important. So next book, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. This book is one of my favorites. Gothic horror vibes. If you want something a little bit scary, definitely read this. It follows the story of Victor Frankenstein, who creates a monster. Well, he doesn't intentionally create a monster, he wants to create life, and he ends up creating a monster who he's sort of disgusted by, and he rejects it and kind of lets this monster fend for itself. This monster ends up wanting to seek revenge on its creator because he doesn't understand why he'd create him and abandon him, and he basically doesn't understand why the creator would do that. So he doesn't really understand why his creator has done this, and he wants to seek revenge on him. So this is a story about that, and I've mentioned this before in one of my book videos, but yeah, I'm going to include it again because it's just one of those books that after I read it I was like, oh, I don't know, I just gained a new perspective on human nature and how, I guess, to understand why we are the way we are, and kind of looking at morality and ideas of good and bad in society, and whether we are inherently bad or inherently inclined to do violent things or cruel things, or whether we are naturally inclined to do good things. And I don't know, I like books that have those themes in it, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading this. I got really hooked on this book when I read it the first time, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. Yeah, it's called Frankenstein, also known as the modern Prometheus, and I just love the kind of background context of this book, where it was very controversial at the time, looking at ideas of playing God, and I love books like that which at the time are very controversial but I have so much to say, and I just love the writing style of it and just how it portrays these concepts of good, evil and human nature. I just love how it's portrayed in the monster, and also how we gain a perspective on his side of things, how he feels abandoned and rejected by his creator, which he's not been conditioned to love, so he goes and acts out on that. That's why he's violent. So it's just a nice, interesting take on why people are pushed to do bad things and the impact of how people are treated and becoming who we are. And yeah, it looks at consequences of, I guess, playing God and taking a sort of power stance. Yeah, it looks at ideas on playing God and the consequences of such, and what happens when you try to like just take these matters into your own hands. Yeah, I love this book, and I need to reread it again, because once I love a book I just want to reread it as many times as I can. But yeah, this book looks at, I guess, the harsh nature of reality and of human life, and how, you know, people are pushed to do bad things, and it's a result of their consequences of how they're treated, which is why they go on to do such things. And I just thought it's such an interesting take and perspective on that, by looking at how a scientist or a creator creates a being, and it's, I guess, this tied responsibility that they have. And I just, yeah, I love this book, and it's so beautifully written. The scenery in it, everything about it has this ambience to it, which is dark and it's eerie, and it's so like well written. I love it, and I need to read more of Mary Shelley's work because she knows what she's onto, and I think she as a person is so interesting. You know, her whole story with Percy Bysshe Shelley, I just think it's so interesting. I keep saying interesting, please give me a better word to say because I keep saying it. Another cool fact about this book is that it was initially printed anonymously, which I find so cool. I love when books are published kind of anonymously or after someone has died. I just think that's such a cool concept, because people are afraid to put their work out there because they don't want it to be like taken badly. But this book, I mean, it was controversial at the time, but it was received so well because it was saying something that other people weren't, which is another reason why I had to include this, because it just is such like a cool take. I say cool, I feel like I use such bad words to describe books, but I just love this book. Love the gothic themes, love the gothic eerie horror vibes to it, and I feel like it's one of like the first like horror books which I never really started reading, but yeah, this made me want to read more of it. And yeah, love this book. It is beautiful and really sad as well. It's a very sad book. I think when you gain a bigger perspective on the monster and his backstory, I think you just kind of have a bit more empathy towards him, when initially he's created out to be, or you know, you want him to be this negative evil character, but you gain an understanding of why he is the way he is, and you can't really blame him for that. And yeah, I'm going to quickly go on to the last book before my camera dies because I didn't charge it enough. But last book is The Trial by Franz Kafka, which again, his whole work has this whole ambience to it, which you may know as Kafkaesque, but I just love that side of his work. I love that vibe about him, and just his backstory himself, how he thought his work wasn't like good and worthless, and a lot of his works, including The Trial, were published after he died, because he initially said he wanted all his work to be like destroyed because he didn't think it was good, but his friend or publisher did it on behalf of him, which if he didn't do that, wouldn't be here today, wouldn't be able to read it. But I think that's such an interesting part of his character and kind of the thoughts he puts into his books. And Kafka's work mainly focuses around like the abstract, the absurd, the surrealist parts of reality, which I love reading into because I feel like I get so hooked on it and want to understand more about the absurdities of life, and this book does that really amazingly. And it basically follows the story of this guy, the main character, Joseph K, who gets arrested for a crime that he did or didn't commit, and you're never told what the crime is, and he never, I guess, admits to this crime which did or did not happen. And it basically follows his trial through that, and you get very lost in it alongside him. He doesn't know what's going on, but he has to go along this trial defending himself against something he doesn't know what happened, and we're never told what it is. So it's such like a surreal book to follow because you're trying to understand it alongside him. I love existentialist books. I love books that touch on that. This book kind of got me onto the sort of Albert Camus side of reading, and I find it so cool to read books on like the nature of reality, and they kind of understand the nature of reality in a different way. So for example, it looks at the trial, and it looks at how a trial is, you know, how a trial like happens. I can't even talk. It looks at like the kind of order of a trial, but it actually says more about the, you know, nature of reality. I find that such an interesting way to look at that and kind of understand more about it. It looks at the problems that bureaucracy has and how we are put in this oppressive system trying to defend ourselves, and it's not just in like the extremes of having a case, but it's in the daily life. You know, we are oppressed, we lack our freedom, we have to try constantly defend ourselves and push through. And I don't want to spoil this book, so if you don't want spoilers, like, I guess just kind of skip past this, but in the end he basically has to live with this trial, and it's just that in itself just like is the epitome of what this book is trying to say, is that we're constantly trapped in this cyclical nature of life, and it kind of never ends, and that is just life. Which this is why I find existentialism so interesting, because it goes into this whole chaos and absurdities, but to the core of it, like, that is just life, that is what it is. And yeah, I love that. I find it so interesting. Yeah, it just looks at the paradox of society where freedom is promoted but we don't actually have freedom. Kafka, his work just looks at social systems, human nature, individuality, autonomy, those themes, which I guess have been themes in all the other books I've kind of been talking about. Isolation and loneliness, I guess. This is the kind of themes of this book, and yeah, I love it. And importantly, I love the theme of kind of searching for meaning in the chaos. Like, despite the trial and despite everything, I guess there's meaning to be found in that. He tries to keep going even though he doesn't know what's going on, which is a nice symbol of life. Is we don't know what's going on, but we still just try to find some sort of meaning in that. We try to find some meaning and purpose in the chaos. And this is one of the books I got lost in reading. Not I got lost in it, but you just get very like involved in it. You feel like you're kind of there. This is how descriptive the book is and how absurd it is. You kind of go with him in the trial and you're like, what is going on? And I remember being so frustrated in the book, when reading the book, trying to find out what he did. Like, I kept reading through it really quickly. I was like, what did he do? What was the crime? And I just missed the point completely when I initially read it, because I was like, oh, like, that's not the point of the book. It's not about what he did or didn't do. It's just about the whole process of that and the paradox of being stuck in that system. Anyways, I'm gonna cut this video short because my camera's gonna die. And yeah, I feel like I've been waffling so much about these books, but I just wanted to recommend them to you, to give them a read, because I think that everyone should read them at least once in their lives. All of the books I mentioned are kind of similar in the same ways of having themes that touch on like human nature, society, etc, etc. But yeah, if you have read any of these books and have any other more takes or ideas on them, comment them below. And if you're not already subscribed, subscribe, because I'm going to be posting some more content on books. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.